dark side. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the dark side. If you're watching this in replay, we appreciate you coming back to have a look. We are happy you're joining us. So welcome to the dark side. The dark side is with me, Pastor Purple, and TC Storm. This way. Okay, so today's topic is a difficult one, or a controversial one, I should say. I have to be honest, I hesitated quite a lot. We've been researching for 2 weeks and I hesitated as to whether we were going to do this because I know that it's not an easy conversation to have, but we don't shy away from difficult conversations, do we?
No.
No. He looked at me for a minute. I was like, no, we don't. Come on now, back me up. Okay, so we're doing the dark side of vaccinations, and the first thing we need to do is make two very important disclaimers, because I think that with the current climate of blocking, banning, reporting, trolling, there needs to be some clarity as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. So you're an activist, I'm a theologian with a teaching and business background. You have an activism background with photography, etc. We are who we are. We're not claiming to be anything other than who we are in this call. And so that means that we're not scientists. Neither of us are scientists. We may have studied science like most of the world at high school level, etc. But I certainly didn't do it for my degree yet. I say yet because I loved chemistry. I was very good at chemistry. So, one day I'll go back and do some fun with chemistry. Who knows? But we're not scientists. That's the disclaimer number one. So we're here to ask questions of science, to probe, to find answers if we can. But to challenge us to think critically is what we're really challenging. How do we think critically? How do we not get swept up and caught up in some of the negativity? So that's one disclaimer. The second disclaimer is that we're not anti-vaxxers. We are not, repeat, anti-vaxxers. Our children are up to date with their vaccinations. We are up to date with our vaccinations. When we go to different countries and we have to take things to prevent disease and sickness, we take those things. I mean, by no means an anti-vaxxer. I may have questions about vaccinations, but I'm certainly not an anti-vaxxer. So I think that's really clear. And we're not here to debate the anti-vaxxer position, and I'm not here to really debate scientists. Like, those two positions I'm not really here for the debate of. We're here to ask integrity questions, critical thinking questions, questions about safety, questions that pertain to how we make choices as to whether we take or do not take the current vaccine is potentially what we're asking for. But to do that, we're taking a look at the dark side, as always, which is kind of an alternative, as you know, look to this subject. So this is not an easy one. I feel like we have to start with why we're doing this. So I'm talking a lot. I feel like you're just looking at me at the moment, but okay, I'll just continue on. Introducing. Jump in at any point, Mr. Storm. I would appreciate it. So why are we doing this? So we've lived through, we're living through a pandemic, a global pandemic. We've had pandemics before, but this is a global pandemic. It is affecting people across the entire world. It is causing harm, devastation, death, and suffering to millions of people. And it's really a difficult time for the world as we enter a phase which we've not had before. We've had pandemics in this way, of it being so globally received everywhere, of it having challenges to how we move, the movement of people, etc., etc. These are things that we're doing for the first time in a generation, really. And so with that, of course, there was a push towards, can we find a vaccine to cure or to prevent people catching this virus? And so that's been the big push. Vaccinations normally take a long time, and we'll go into that. I think it's really good to unpack that. But there are vaccinations that are being approved right now, and the first one went to the British population. The first woman went and had hers. 91 years old was she? and
Old.
something very old lady, and she so she took the first vaccine in the UK. The vaccinations are now beginning to be rolled out across Europe and other places. People are taking those vaccines. There is a list of order of priorities in most countries, and the expectation is that people will begin to start having access to vaccinations within the year. But this is by no means a simple issue. The population surveys tell us that 30 to 40% of the British public won't take a vaccine at this point. 1/3 of French respondents said they would take it. So that means that 2/3 said they would not take the current vaccine. 60% of Germans have said that they have that they would be willing to take it, meaning 40% won't. 60% of Poland and Hungary populations have said they would be willing. And again, that means that 40% of your population is unwilling to take a vaccine. To put that in context, I think you were saying that it's something like 95% of your population take their regular vaccinations. Is it like that?
It's something like 99% of the population are vaccinated. Between 98 and 99%, I think. And those percentages, and this is one of the questions about the vaccination program, is that how effective will it be? Because if you have such a large proportion of people not taking it, you don't reach critical mass to achieve immunity throughout your population. And so, yeah, as I said, these are some of the challenges that I think need to be overcome, in that, people aren't trusting the vaccination program. I think people aren't trusting their governments and people in authority and these traditional institutions of authority, because they've spent decades eroding trust in them. And when I say they, I mean people in power. So the governments themselves have spent decades eroding people's confidence in these bodies and traditional institutions of authority, that people are just look at it and be like, no, I'm good.
And so I think that's really indicative of, what I read out as the statistics of the countries. You see that where governments have been more transparent, have been much more clear with their instructions, have not fluctuated quite as much, there is a higher percentage of people who are willing to take the vaccine. 60% of Germans said they would take it, but they're amongst the highest in Europe. Most other countries in Europe are struggling with that number. A lot of it's the reverse. It's only 40% of people would take the vaccine versus the 60% who will not take it. And if I think about how things are in, say, our home country of the UK, well, I've heard for decades on decades, different lies, allegations, etc. People putting the health system down, putting the NHS down, putting down their efficiency, their ability to work, comparing them to slower organisations, making it out as if they're unable to do their jobs. When the truth is, I've had brilliant healthcare my whole life. Yes, I've had one or two incidents, but there are competent, brilliant people who work within that system. And while there may be mismanagement of funds at the administrative level, I certainly by no means don't trust the doctors and nurses and the staff, midwives, etc., that I come into contact with in the hospitals. And the idea that you've diminished, say, the NHS to the point that there is a question mark in my head. There is some kind of, do I trust what the government's saying? Because they have eroded, they have diminished, they have made bad, I guess, poor English way, your trust in the organisation.
Yeah, well, I think it goes beyond the NHS. I think it goes beyond any health institutional organization. But yeah. I think it's important that it's across the board that the erosion of public trust has taken place. So, for example, you look at the UK, you brought that up as an example. They've spent decades, and this is both sides of the aisle, the political spectrum, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. They've spent decades eroding trust in the EU.
Yeah.
Okay? And so, of course,
Yeah.
When you start doing things like that, you start to undermine even your own authority.
Yes.
Okay, because people are now going to be like, well, if I can't trust them, who else can I not trust?
Yeah.
And on the other side of the pond, you've got the megalomaniac dictator wannabe who has spent the past 4 years telling everybody they can't trust anybody but him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here's the thing.
Those chickens are coming to roost, as they say, in that situation.
Listen, you see how obese that dude is? I don't think a chicken's getting a chance to roost around him. So,
oh my gosh. At least we're
yeah.
making good jokes tonight. Put your comments in the comment section, by the way. Obviously, like and subscribe to the link so that you can follow us. But please put your comments in the comment section. Questions if you want us to tackle a particular question, of course. But I think you're right. If I continue down that thought that you're having of the erosion of trust, if I particularly look at the European British thing, if I think about it from a business perspective, which was my former background, there is definitely this move to diminish the Europeanness of Britain, the inclusion, the diversity, the benefits, the pluses, to make those seem as if they're really negatives. So much so that when it's revealed, of course, that it's a Belgian manufacturing plant, or it's a German company, or it's whatever that is making the vaccines, then you get this entire meltdown in Britain over, can we trust them? And it's like, well, really, people, this is, some of these questions are fundamentally, I feel like, the wrong question to be asking. I know that sounds wrong, and I don't like to say that of a question, but it can I trust the Europeans? Like, what does that even mean? How is that a question?
All I can say is there is a portion of the British population that are like that, and if you ask me, they're crazy because they trust their cucumber that they go and pick up from the supermarket, and that comes from Europe too, So I'm not interested in that, but I think one of the other things that you see and why there's such high levels of mistrust is that politicians in these countries that we're talking about quite often lack integrity.
Right. Okay.
So you have all these lockdown rules, and it's, do as I say, not as I do. Well, if I can see you're doing something different than what you're telling me, when you're telling me to take a vaccine, why am I going to listen to you?
Yes.
Because you don't have the integrity. I can't trust what you're saying, And so,
And there's almost no point in you faking taking it, because that's immediately what I think. Yeah, you're just faking it because you're not. I can't trust you that what's in the vial, in the little injection thing, is going to be what it is, because when you said we should not travel across the country, you traveled across the country in the case of some of our British politicians. When you said we should not have parties of over 3 people, you had a full-out wedding in the case of some Dutch politicians. When you've said you shouldn't be engaging in illicit sex acts with people you don't know because of bubbling issues, we've seen that happen in Belgium. That there is this integrity issue in every country, it feels like, across the board, where you say as politicians you should do this thing, and then we see you. It's not like we didn't see you. Yeah. We see you doing the complete opposite. I don't trust you're going to do it.
And on the other side of the pond, you had lots of politicians saying, don't travel for Thanksgiving, and they traveled for Thanksgiving.
Right, right.
So, as I said, I think there's a real erosion of trust and lack of integrity that is taking place, But hey, the answer to everything is just take a jaunt off to Bernard Castle.
For those of you joining from Europe or some other part of the world, that is a reference to a politician in Britain who decided that traveling across country, 2 countries, to enjoy time with his family while the country is in a national lockdown. 2 countries under international lockdown. Bless is now the answer to everything. So that's just that little joke for those of you who aren't aware. Go look it up.
To be honest, it's funnier than that, because he decided to see if it would, to test his eyesight to see if it was safe to drive by driving.
And by playing at a castle, which is the reference to the castle. Taking my kid out and coughing over everyone. Coughing all over a castle. That's what he did. Bless him. So there's that element that we're saying that we're definitely seeing the chickens coming home to roost, so to speak, with the element of trust erosion, of people not trusting their governments, their politicians, etc. And so how does that work? How is that going to work? How is this going to pan out if you're getting such high percentages of people saying, for whatever reasons, they will not take it?
Right. I just want to read a quote actually from an article that I got from the New England Journal of Medicine.
Okay.
And this is probably going to link to something that we're going to come on to later, because it's about a specific community. But what it says, or the title of the article, is Trustworthiness Before Trust: COVID-19 Vaccine Trials in the Black Community. So this is written in November 2020. And what it says is, as the race to develop a vaccine for COVID-19 has reached phase 3 clinical trials, concerns are increasing about the low rates of trial participation in important subgroups, including Black communities. Recent data show that although Black people make up 13% of the US population, they account for 21% of deaths from COVID-19, but only 3% of enrollees in vaccine trials.
Right.
Okay. Now that brings up other issues regarding the vaccine and how effective will it be within certain communities, because they talk about environmental exposures can result in difference in immunologic responses and the efficacy of vaccines and things like that. But what they go on to say is that one of the greatest barriers to greater participation of Black people in the COVID-19 trials is actually mistrust of the establishment and institutions. Now, as I said, we're probably going to go on to talk about this because there are historical reasons, valid historical reasons for why there is such mistrust.
Right. So let's do some quick unpacking, I guess, so that we can get to these questions, because I think they're important questions. So I think it's important to say that all vaccinations are approved around the world by different health organizations. In the US, it's the CDC and the FDA that do that work. In the UK, it's the NHS and MHRA. In the European Union, it's EMA. So there are different organizations that approve for vaccinations. They have strict rules of how that happens. There is the development of vaccinations is a long process. It's not a short process by any. It first has to go into small batch, then it has to go to in vitro, which is a laboratory type testing, or they can do in vivo, which is the animal type testing, and then goes on to 3 phases of clinical trials. So there's a lot of steps that have to be gone through. And to give you an example, many people have the MenB virus vaccination. So many of us have that vaccination in us. That actually took 20 years to go from the idea to the vaccine. So it took 20 years in the total process from the idea that we should do this, so that's really early stages, to the actual vaccination being a readily part of national programs around the world. So that's for the MenB, which is the recent addition to the vaccination programs. That's one of our recent additions to our vaccination programs around the world. And I say that because I think the legitimate question then you have to ask, which I think is a legitimate question, if it took 20 years for MenB to go from a concept, an idea, to a vaccine on a large-scale rollout, how are you doing it in 6 months? How did you do it in 6 months? Like, you've done it, well, let's say a year. Let's give them a year because, of course, they knew, and there were people working in the lab, we're told. From the time the thing came onto the scene, people started working with it. So a year you've had coronavirus. How did you get a vaccine? How did you condense 20 years of work into 1 year? And I think that's a legitimate question. I think. I don't know if you would agree with me, Mr. Storm, but I think this is a legitimate question.
Listen, I done said, and I think I may have said it on here in a different program, until I see all them Karens taking up that vaccine, don't talk to me about it.
Yes. So I think as consumers, as people, as humans on the planet, I think it's a legitimate question. There have been, to that end, a number of reports given about how the COVID vaccine for the 2020 vaccine has been developed. And actually, what surprised me is the longevity with which they had been working on a vaccine for COVID-related illnesses. So not this particular strain, but COVID, as in a corona, as in a whole, was it like 20?
Virus, yeah.
The virus, the whole family of viruses, they have been working on vaccines because of the number of other strains of this particular virus they've had. So they have been working on this for a longer period of time, which may reassure some people to know that it wasn't just something they cooked up from January, or in some cases we heard from some companies June, but that family. So there are a number of places that you can go where you can find that information. The Guardian newspaper has great articles on that. So does the BBC website. By no means saying which one you should read or what have you, but I just know that I found good articles on the history of the development of these particular vaccines on those websites, with references, with quotations, so that you can go and find the source material, and in an easy to follow English fashion if English is your second language. So of course, bearing in mind that a lot of our listeners and viewers are from English as a second language. So those are the ones that I know of. But I think that's a legitimate question. If Men B, which is our current newest vaccination before this one, took 20 years, then shouldn't that? And to that end, we've had the incident immediately of they gave the vaccine on the first day, and by day 2, okay, nobody with a pre-existing allergy, serious allergy, can take this vaccine. Whoop! Immediately, within 24 hours, they knew that that was going to be a problem. Which leads us to a point that you were talking about, which I found really interesting. You asked earlier if when I took the kids to get vaccinated, did anyone ask if our children had allergies? Now, we've been asked a lot in the children's lifetime about allergies, a lot. But I don't remember, honestly or genuinely, if when we took the children to get vaccinated, if we were asked that question, which raised the point that I was really surprised by what you said, quite frankly.
Yeah. You saw in these, just with the COVID-19 one specifically right now, that you had the allergic reactions. But actually there are reports showing that actually a number of people do have, it is one of the very rare side effects, but a number of people do have an anaphylactic response to vaccinations. And I think it's interesting that you're not asked that typically. I've never been asked that before I've had a vaccination for travel. I've never been asked that when taking the children for vaccinations. And so there's a real danger in here within the process of how things are done, that actually you're not asking these questions beforehand. So it's not necessarily that the vaccination itself might be dangerous, but the process can very well be dangerous.
Right. Okay.
Well, the vaccine, of course, if it creates an anaphylactic response, is dangerous. But
which is why they said
you can
in
limit
this
that.
case. Yeah.
You can limit that by asking that screening question beforehand. But I think what the trouble with that is that when you're vaccinating children, how do you know if they're allergic to something or not? Their life's too short. They may not have come into contact with whatever the allergen within it is. And of course, you as a parent, not being asked this question, don't think, oh, there might be something that my child might be allergic to in it, if you are aware of the allergens.
Right, and there are 4 main categories, aren't there, for what's in a vaccine? So there are 4 main components that are in a vaccine, and for those 4 main components, you can obviously have an allergy to the ones that don't naturally reside in your body. So there are 2 that naturally reside in your body, those components, but there are 2 that do not naturally reside in your body. So stabilizers, for example, they're found in foods, but as you say, if you are a little person and you're on milk only, breast milk only in most cases when you get your first vaccines, we have no idea what food you're allergic to yet, only if you've had an allergic reaction because of your mother's eating habit, which can happen, but again is rare. So there's that, and there's also the kind of adjuvants. I hope I've said that right, but that's the kind of aspirin type, antiperspirant type things that they put into it to boost its efficacy. And those can of course be allergens. So I never thought about allergic reactions to a vaccination before we started doing this research, and it's rare, but I think it's still quite scary because we both have particular allergies, which we've both been given the thing that we're allergic to by a trusted health professional through some oversights and neglects, but okay, and we've both had to live with the consequences of those reactions. But it's interesting to think that that's a really simple question that could be asked at screening, which could help you to work out how to monitor somebody even after they've had the vaccine. So of course, if you find out that somebody has a serious allergy, then you would want to say to them, keep your EpiPen with you, please report in 24 hours later, 48 hours, so that we know that you've not had, we can monitor you maybe differently than we're going to monitor the person who we tell just take 2 paracetamols and go to bed. So different. If you have a mild reaction to a vaccination, the common thing is take 2 paracetamols and go to bed. So it's a different way of monitoring, even not that you wouldn't take it, but it may be just to heighten that awareness to monitor you differently. And it's shocking that people don't even ask that question, I think. Interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, closely related to this and what we were talking about before in terms of the time frame for the creation of this COVID-19 vaccine in particular, is that we are not aware of the long-term effects of this. Not enough study has been done, and but it's not just the COVID-19. There's an article I came across, on the U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Health Institutes of Health.
Okay.
Sorry, Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health.
You can copy and paste it and stick it in the comments. I'll put it on the screen if that makes it easier.
Yeah. But basically, what the person was saying was, in the article, was that the public should be told that vaccines may have long-term adverse effects.
Okay, but I knew this.
Right?
Right. And so this is something that I'm keenly aware of. So I think in terms of the UK system, we do get told that. I remember being told that for the children, that in rare cases there are long-term adverse effects from it, and you need to monitor if this happens or that happens, then you need to come in, basically. And that's in the short term, but those short-term responses can have long-term consequences. So I knew, and I think that a lot of us know that maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm wrong, but that there can be long-term side effects from taking a vaccination, because of course you're putting the thing in your body so that you want to fight.
Yes, but what would you say those long-term side effects might be?
I've never thought about that. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Although, having done my research now. Do you want me to bring in the one about the swine flu?
You can do. I'm just gonna comment on this article, and what they're saying is that, you know, potential rare adverse effects are, you know, like chronic immunological diseases such as asthma, allergies, and things like that. Which, you know, when you're told as a parent taking a child for vaccination, there may be long-term adverse effects. I don't think those are quite the things that you imagine. And they say, you know, diabetes is a possible
okay, I never imagined diabetes.
You know, and so these aren't not the things that you imagine. So when you're talking about consent for your child to have a vaccination, are you really getting informed consent? Are you really giving an informed consent? If they're not telling you, well, actually, these are the potential long-term effects.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that I knew the asthma one. I did know that because they say respiratory illnesses. So I knew that. I didn't know the diabetes one. I find that quite interesting. It's a weird link for me. So I would have to think. My brain is like now ticking in overtime going, well, how does that work out? And how do you know that the vaccine has caused diabetes? Diabetes is a common can occur as a common thing. So how do you know that it was caused by the by the vaccination? I think that's a really interesting one. Yeah, I think you are told that there can be risks. You are told that there can be long-term side effects. You are told that these are rare, and then your child is a needle's pushed in their arm and you move on. What I have found pleasantly surprising living in a different country and having a child that needed to be vaccinated is that I had a lot more freedom, I felt, to choose here when vaccinations were administered, when I was comfortable with that process and how that process would go. And I felt like I had much more control and gave much more consent here over how my child's vaccination process went. Having said that, I've also had the challenges of, you know, your child's at a certain age and you just have to vaccinate them. There isn't, well, you don't have to do anything, but it is in their best interest to vaccinate them. But what if your child is deathly afraid of of injections or needles, and there isn't another method by which to give a child a vaccination, apparently? I'm feeling very frustrated about that process. And so I think I felt in recent years, particularly living not in mainland UK, that I had much more consent options, much more flexibility given to me, that I had some more control over the vaccination process. However, reading the information on how staff, hospital workers, etc., are being told that in order to work, they need to have this COVID-19 vaccine. I have found that a little shocking. So the opposite seems to be true for this particular vaccination. For some people, it seems in the way that it's being written and promoted is that, you know, if you want to keep your job, you need to get vaccinated because we can't have you in this place without a vaccination. You're a risk. Which I found quite surprising, that they would make it almost mandatory for doctors, nurses, hospital workers, you know, whoever works in that environment, to have a vaccination of this type at this point. That I found quite interesting, and it raised questions for me, like, is that how we really build trust in people, is to say to them it's your job or this vaccine? I mean, that just to me didn't seem like the right way to go about this element of trust that you have. This problem of trust is make it mandatory for your hospital workers to have this thing.
Yeah, I know some people in the NHS and they have questions over the vaccine, and don't particularly want to take it. So you have people within the medical profession that have their own questions, some of which have been raised tonight about, what are the long-term effects? You haven't studied this enough. I don't feel I can trust it. And the article that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, talks, or what the conclusion of it basically is that the public should be informed about the possible long-term effects, because an educated public will probably demand proper safety studies before widespread immunization. So talking about new vaccines coming onto the market. Of course, they're telling me this has been done safely, but
has it? And there are questions. And I think what's interesting about this vaccination is that you have so much choice. Of course, Pfizer have been the first one to be tested, to be given the approval and have gone to the public. But of course, Oxford is right behind them. That is the next one who's going to get approval. And now there seems to be this element of, well, you can have a vaccine for this corona, but it could come from several different companies. And those companies may have different side effects. Those companies may have different methodologies. One of the big things has been that Pfizer's vaccine has to be kept at -70, whereas Oxford's doesn't, and that makes a difference on how it's stored, its efficacy, its transmission, etc. And that has I've got questions. Why why the big differences? What is happening here?
Well, it's not just those. You've got the Russian one, which Vladimir Putin refuses to take.
Didn't he give that to his daughter? Isn't that what we're led to believe? Isn't that what he wants us to believe? It's okay, I don't need to take it. He gave it to his daughter. Isn't that?
You probably don't like her.
Listen, I'm not trying to say that we should trust it. I'm going to stay out of that because I think that's a different political question, so I won't rise to the bait of that one. But I think it's interesting that we have these vaccines. I haven't heard, and maybe are there vaccines coming out of Asian countries? Because they were
There's a Chinese one which was being tested in the Middle East, I believe, somewhere. That was meant to have like an 84% success rate.
So here's another question. So here's something that's really interesting. So one of the questions I have is, where have you tested this? So I've mentioned already that you have 3 clear stages. So you have the small batch, you have the in vivo, the in vitro. Okay, so those are things that happen before they get to human trial. And then you have the human trials, the clinical trials. And those clinical trials happen in 3 stages. What I found interesting is the places in which the clinical trials are being carried out. So the clinical trials, you just say, well, we've got a Chinese one being developed, but it's being trialed out in the Middle East. We've got some of the Pfizer ones, I think, was trialed out in Brazil. So, they've been trialed in very unusual places.
Listen, from the get-go, I don't know if you remember the furor of when the French scientists said that they wanted to try it out in Africa. They wanted to do the experiments in Africa.
Okay, which leads us to a point I'm not quite. So I want to do that for the last quarter of an hour, to spend that time on that particular point. So before we get there, this surprised me, and I don't know if you knew this, but this was new for me. So the swine flu vaccine. Does everybody remember the swine flu pandemic? You remember that? I remember the swine flu pandemic. You had it. You pretty much get everything. Bless you. So we lived through that. It wasn't as deadly as what it is now, but it was really sick. 6 million people. The vaccine was called Pandemrix. 6 million people in Britain got this vaccine. 31 million people across Europe, and it was withdrawn. So this was in 2009, 2010. So this was the last pandemic we had. And it was withdrawn because of the side effects of narcolepsy. Approximately 1 in every 55,000 people got narcolepsy, just developed narcolepsy. And so the British awarding body withdrew it. So MHRA, who I mentioned before, withdrew it from Britain. I can't speak to every European country, so I don't know what's happening elsewhere. But in the UK, you're no longer receiving Pandemrix, which is the vaccine for, or was a vaccine for, swine flu. And it was actually withdrawn. And I was really surprised because I did not hear anything about that. Like, I do not remember reading all of these articles, and I would say I'm fairly up to date. I read quite a lot. And 2009-10 were big life moment events for us. So I remember that. In 2013, again, I had a little bit of time on my hands. I know what I was doing in that year. So I know I was reading, but I do not remember this making as big a headline. There's something like 900 extra people now have narcolepsy as a result of, in the UK, as a result of having this vaccine, which is a lot of people.
And I just want to inject here that there is relevance between that and this vaccine being mandatory, or appearing to be mandatory for those working in the health profession. With the swine flu vaccine, the Pandemrix, there is a case of a nurse who committed suicide after developing narcolepsy after receiving the vaccination.
Right.
And she was vaccinated. She was required to be vaccinated against her wishes in order to continue her job.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about making this
mandatory
for people in the health profession,
yeah.
and we don't know the long-term effects of it, because this wasn't found out for a couple of years after the mass vaccinations had already occurred.
Yeah, so the vaccinations occurred in 2009, 2010, and by 2013 it was withdrawn through the market. So it took 3 years effectively for it to go. So I'm basically giving this COVID-19 5 to 10 years before I go anywhere near it, personally speaking.
Look, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I need evidence that this thing is safe.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen that yet. As I said, nobody knows the long-term effects. The same as they didn't understand the adverse effects of the Pandemrix causing narcolepsy. And I think it's dangerous, considering what we have seen historically, even recently with the Pandemrix vaccine and its adverse effects, that we are making people take these vaccinations.
Yeah. Okay, which I think leads us, I think we've covered the other questions that we have regarding the vaccine, which leads us to one huge, enormous question, or elephant in the room, is why do we, you and I particularly, have questions, and why do people who are like us have questions? So people who take vaccines, who've never really I may have delayed the vaccinations for my children. I'm not an anti-vaxxer in any way. I do trust my medical professionals. I do, follow medical advice generally. I'm involved in the Netherlands. You're involved in your medical care. So we trust our systems. We take medications. We're not anti by any stretch of the imagination. Why would people like you and I have such deep questions? And we have spoke of some of the overriding questions for people generally, but you and I have very specific reasons as to why we have questions regarding this vaccination, and that has been alluded to throughout this conversation. But I think needs to be overtly stated now. I guess it's that time. Go ahead.
In the words of James Brown, I'm black and I'm proud, and I'll say it now. And there is a historical context and reasons for why I, as a black person, do not trust vaccinations so easily, especially when they come out as quickly as this. There are historical incidents of people from the African diaspora being used as guinea pigs.
Mm-hmm.
There is probably one of the most famous ones comes out of the States, the Tuskegee Experiment, where they intentionally infected African American men with syphilis to observe the results. Or people will be coming in with syphilis and they would tell them, oh, we're going to give you a medicine. And they weren't giving them the medicine in order to observe the results. And this was the 1960s, I think this was. So we're not even talking about that long ago. Actually, you know what? Let me give you the exact date.
Yes, let's do that. So I think it's really important to say that Black and brown communities around the world have this question. We mentioned already that when the early conversations and development on vaccinations was happening, there were jokes made that we should test this on Africans. We should just take this virus and just test it on them first. We should do those experiments on those people. And those were made by leading scientists, reputable companies, and yes, they had to retract, reframe, and say differently. But the point being that they aren't the first, and by no means, and we will give you some more illustrations, including the Tuskegee, of where we are used, Black and brown bodies across the globe are used as experiments.
Sorry. No, carry on, and then I'll give the information.
No, I'm ready for you to give the information on the dates.
So the exact duration for the Tuskegee experiment was between 1932 to 1972.
And so I thought it was the 1940s. So when you said 1960s, I was like, no, he's got the date wrong. It's the 1940s. No. So I was really like the 1940s. 1932 to 1972. That is the lifetime. So like, what is that? Right. That's decades.
It is. And the only reason it was
4 decades.
Yes, but the only reason it was stopped was because it was the details of it were leaked to the press.
Yes, which is frightening to think that how many other experiments have happened, and because we don't know, then this just goes on people. Like, this is just happening, but they're just not telling us, because that's recent history. That's not like centuries ago. That's 72. I was like, not to give away my age, but it's not so far from when I was born, No. It's like, what is that?
Jeez.
Don't fall off don't like kill yourself up there.
Listen, I need to get my proper chair back. Yeah, so what was I saying? Yeah, so you have the fact that it was exposed, but you also have to remember that penicillin has been around since the 1940s. So you could have been treating these people for 30 years.
And you were just experimenting.
You did not do it. You decided to carry on your experiments. Yeah, so you have to understand that when things like this happen, we're talking about, well, this is just another reason. And if it was not leaked to the press, how much longer would this have been going on for?
Right. And I think that's because, it's not 1970s again. I mean, for some people, for some of our younger viewers and who tune into this, they will be like, that's a lifetime ago. But actually, it's the life of your parents. With all due respect, it's not that long ago. That's really scary, because you just think you could have been treating people and instead you were experimenting on them. So there's that particular joyous incident.
Yeah, then you have, you take it back even further in history to Marion Sims, who is considered, the father of gynecology.
Oh, please, let's not.
And he would experiment
on
Black women who were his slaves, and he would do it without anesthetic. you know.
He
And
would do it without treating them like humans. I mean, it was just the most
yes,
awful.
they weren't treated as humans.
Yeah.
And so he's considered the father of gynecology, but no thought or concern is given to, actually the history of how he came about his discoveries.
And actually, that's only happening now. However long later is that conversation really happening among scientists and doctors, etc. And the reason that's happening is because the community brought that to the press and have highlighted again. It's been exposed, and people are beginning to question the ethical discoveries that were made at that time, because how can this be? And his long-lasting effects of what he did still is in the veins of the health systems around the world. Black women are still treated as if they don't have any feelings. There are famous cases of women who are having babies who are screaming and telling them there's something wrong, and have ended up on the ER table because they are not taken seriously. People do not believe that we experience pain. They do not believe that we feel pain. And it goes back to, you can trace it directly back to this guy's disgusting, awful behavior. Like, there's the evilness of what he did.
Yes. And I think you have all of that going on. You have also the fact that there are disparities within healthcare in the treatment of Black people.
Right.
There's a book called Medical Apartheid. I can't remember who it's by at this point in time, but it's worth checking out for anybody watching this. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It's eye-opening to see the disparities in care between Black people and white people. But you also have the fact, and I mentioned this earlier, the article that was written in November of this year about the lack of Black people involved in clinical trials, and the fact that environmental factors can affect the immune responses in people, which affects the efficacy and the safety of vaccinations. So if you're not getting Black people involved in these studies, in these trials, you cannot accurately speak to the safety of these trials when it comes to that community.
Yeah. And I think that's, I remember listening, I think it was Dr. Fauci of the States, and he was talking about the fact that this is one of his big concerns, is that trust within the Black community is so low for governmental organizations, and particularly medical organizations, because medical apartheid, this kind of separation, and how different it is, and how many experiments and how many things, Henrietta Lacks, for example, how she was treated, and how her, the whole situation surrounding her story, and how that came out into the limelight because, again, somebody leaked it to the press and it became a story. And so because of all these reasons, and many, many, many more that, some of which we'll continue to mention today, people within the Black community do not sign up regularly. And this was his big worry, that the people who needed it the most, it may not have the efficacy on it, may not work as well on, because they're not on the trial. And because they're not on the trial, then of course we don't know how it affects them. We don't know if it works on them. There are questions, scientific questions, that need to be answered. And I remember him doing that discussion and sitting and listening to him, and for the first time realized that that's going to be an uphill struggle, because even as I listened to him saying it, I knew that I was never going to sign up for a medical trial. Like, I listened to him, and I wanted to be like, like I heard what he was saying. I heard the actual, we need you to do this because we need to know if it works for your community. We need to figure out how to actually make it work effectively across the board. And I heard the resounding no from my ancestors. Like I heard, it felt like my whole ancestors go, no, don't do that, Tabitha. Like, don't do that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to make a distinction between the mistrust of Black communities in vaccination programs like this and anti-vaxxers.
Right, because they are two distinctly different things. Right, yeah. Yes.
And I think it's important to make that distinction.
Yes.
But as I said, there's a history of this. So you had, part of the reason why Black people are reticent to take part in these trials is that often it's their communities that are at the back of the line when it comes to dishing out the vaccine.
So I'm going to do all of this. I'm going to sacrifice my life, and my people still won't get what they need. You're at the back of the queue, and eventually, sometime before all of us die, you'll get seen. Is that feeling? And I think that's really important. I like the fact that you've distinguished between anti-vaxxers, which is a very different community than, I say community, it's a different group than the Black community, who have a very different relationship with power systems, with companies, with medical experimentation, etc. And even thinking about from a company perspective, we have the Nestle scandal, which is an ongoing. I thought this thing had died, and Nestle just every single time just gets worse and worse. But the problems with what they were doing with milk, baby milk, in African nations is horrific, and the low grade quality they were sending, the addictiveness, the fact that they knew that people wouldn't have access to clean water and that it was creating other problems, to this day is still a problem within the company of Nestle, and it's still a reason why I don't support Nestle as a company and try to avoid buying their products. They're so everywhere, it's difficult, but I do try not to buy their products. And I've recently found out some products that I like have just gone onto my no buy list. I was devastated, but as a member of that community, when you know that people are degrading your humanity, they're killing you with their hate, you can't then just be like, yeah, we'll sign up and we'll have an experimental drug tried on us. No thanks, I'm not up for that. And it's not for the reason that an anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theory, it's, what is it, Bill and Melinda Gates are doing this thing and it's them, they're going to plant a chip in you, and I'm not interested in that discussion. Like, it's, for me, that whole discussion is clearly for someone more privileged than I am. I don't need that discussion, but I have legitimate concerns when my history tells me that if I have a side effect from this, I'm statistically more likely to die, because I will not be believed that I am experiencing what I'm experiencing. I'm told that I do not experience pain in the same way as people of white people. I don't experience, so I'm dehuman. Black people are dehumanized to the point that even if we do sign up and do the trials, our people at the back of the queue, even if we do sign up and do the trials and we get a side effect, it's likely it will be more adverse for us, because they won't believe what we're experiencing. They will try to, play Jedi mind tricks on you and make you feel like you're obviously experiencing this in your head. If for any reason these are mental health side effects, like narcolepsy, like anything that affects your mind, you are more likely to end up without the care that you need. So you, statistically, if you are a Black or brown person, than if you are a white person. So these are, these are real frustrations, I guess, that mean that, for Black and brown people around the world, the idea of just signing up to take this vaccination has a different question than other groups. For the African diaspora, particularly, who have come from the enslaved peoples, it has a completely different connotation than it does for other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying. I'm trying not to get too caught up on this particular aspect of the conversation, but it is a massive. The historical reasons are a massive part of why there is such reticence within the Black community and such a mistrust. Because too often we have been experimented on and have not received the benefits of it, or we are the last to receive the benefits of it. And there are still such disparities in healthcare that, although they may have improved,
right,
they're still nowhere near where they need to be. I mean, like in the US, the chances of dying in childbirth for a Black woman are 4 times higher than that of a white woman. Just for example, to give you some of the disparities. I think it's 3 times more likely to die if you get cancer if you're Black, and all these other things. And
I think one that should strike our listeners, and I think I really want them to just let this really occur to them for a moment. They did a study in neonatal units, and they found out that if you are a Black child in a neonatal unit, you have it's 1 in 3 that will. I think it's 1 in 3. I can't remember the exact statistics that will die. And they decided to investigate to see why. And I was reading this article, and I think my heart broke into a million pieces. And they said that basically the Black children in the neonatal unit are last to receive their medication. They normally receive it late. They normally don't get as many cuddles. They normally don't get held enough. They don't get as much attention as from the medical staff. And bearing in mind that medical staff are still to this day overwhelmingly white in European and other Western countries. So what that means is when your baby, and when we think of babies, I think we think of our most vulnerable, we think of the most innocent. Your baby is lying in the unit with 4 or 5 other babies. Your baby is always last. Your baby will get their medication late. Your baby will be the one that's not picked up and held. Your baby will be ignored, and they'll prick the arm and it might bust a vein or whatever. They don't feel that. It'll be fine because of the color of the baby's skin. That is it. No other explanation. There was no other reason or rhyme that they could come up with than literally African American babies are at the bottom of the pile and therefore are more likely to die in the neonatal unit than any other ethnicity. And that is frightening, because what we normally say is that, well, Black children are always seen as cute and cuddly and adorable, and it's when they turn 7 that they become a threat. We know that statistic. But to think that a helpless baby who's relying on medical staff, and those medical staff would be horrified to find out that that's what's happening in their subconscious. They did that study, and it was like people didn't even realize they were doing it. Some people would be horrified that they found that out, that that's what they did. But that is exactly what was happening, because it's so ingrained in the system, that is the result. That if you have helpless baby in a neonatal unit, how much more helpless can you be? That the Black children are still dying at higher rates, simply because they will always be the last one to receive medication, which means they may receive it late. They may not get picked up as often because, of course, they're Black. They may not have as much time spent with them because they're Black. And that, for me, I think is the crystal or the icing, the cherry on the cake as to why we cannot let the issue of racism just be like, oh, this doesn't affect people. Because if you can do that to a baby, I hate to think what you're doing to the rest of us. And that's unintentionally a lot of the times. That's an unintentional side effect. You don't even think about it in that these are not conscious decisions being made. These are subconscious, under pressure decisions that are being made that are killing children.
Yeah. You know, yeah. I mean, yeah. There's other issues surrounding vaccines. I don't know if you want to go into because of the time. One thing I will say that bothers me is that in the UK, Pfizer have been made exempt from any liability as a result of any adverse reacts to the vaccination.
Now, let's talk about that. How can you be made exempt? What is that about? That leaves me with questions.
Well, here's the thing. So in the States, this may have been in the 40s.
Okay.
It may even been, no, maybe in the 60s or 70s. Anyway, can't remember the exact time frame for this. But what happened was companies that were making vaccinations were getting sued due to adverse effects. So what happened was they were made exempt and compensation would come from the government because they just stopped making the vaccines. They're like, we're losing money because we're getting sued, so we're just going to stop making the vaccines. So in order to have them continue to produce the vaccines, what they did in the States was they said, okay, well, we'll make you exempt from that. The money for the loss will come from government. For any claims must come through the government. Government will decide, yay, nay, whatever, and away you go. And that was so that the drug companies would continue to make the vaccinations.
I think what is frightening about that for me personally is I have a question, simple question. How do you regulate that industry if you make them exempt from their consequences? How do you hold them accountable to a higher medical standard if they are exempt from their consequences? How do you allow them? Because these are companies, these are multi-billion-dollar industries that we're talking about. These are companies that are making profit on profit. These are not companies who are struggling to make a profit. These are GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, all of these companies are enormous and make billions in profit around the globe. How do you hold them to a high medical standard if you're going to say, oh, well, we'll just take the consequence? And what that says is not we're taking the consequence. The public you are paying for your own compensation.
Yeah.
Because you pay taxes. So you are the one paying for your own compensation. Like I'm paying for it. I'm getting shot in the arm and I'm dealing like this like twice.
Let's be real. In the UK, I mean, it's pretty much status quo. It's their modus operandi. I mean, think about how the Treasury was bragging a few years back that they had finally paid for slavery, paid the slavery compensation. So in other words, you're bragging that you made some of the descendants of those slaves pay for their ancestors' slavery. So
I can't even. I just.
You know,
okay, so these are just awful. Yes, it is part of the course. I think there is it's part of the course. We know this, that governments do this, but I think it begs the question: how does that incentivize the medical companies, the scientists, the people that are working on this, to have the highest medical standards if they are exempt from having the highest medical standards? Like, if they just get a free pass, if they're just like, well, we just don't have to deal with it. We'll just keep making the same back. We won't improve it. We won't try and eradicate the thing. We won't change it. We won't do anything. We'll just keep making this. And every time something happens, y'all will just pay for it. So we're not bearing cost, which means we've got no incentive because money talks. Capitalist society, money talks. That's what we're talking about here. Money, if you hit them in the pocket, this is what's going to happen. So yeah, for me, I have questions. I have serious questions about this. But anyway, continue.
But I'm just saying the fact that you've made them exempt from liability, all that does is serve to undermine trust in the product. Because if the product is good, why are you concerned about liability?
But liability is an issue. As we said earlier in the conversation, there are rare, but there are side effects. People can have long-term side effects. They can have allergic reactions. There are side effects to taking a vaccination. They may be rare, but they happen. So liability is an issue. I just don't understand if it's such an effective drug, if you've tested it so well, why you have to be made exempt from your liability, why you don't have insurance to cover that, why you are not actually building that into the program. Like, what is the issue here?
Well, see, and for me, as I said, I don't see why liability is an issue, because especially in the case of this COVID-19, right? You're talking about billions of people having to take the vaccination, and I believe it's 2 doses you need to take.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Of this particular Pfizer one, it's 2 doses.
Right? So you're talking about billions being made off of this product. You might have to pay out 100 or a couple 100 million in compensation to people that would suffer adverse side effects if these side effects are so rare.
Yes. Yes.
Right? That we're talking about, small percentages here. You're still making billions in profit. So you would look at that and you would say, well, it's still cost effective to make the product.
Yeah.
Unless you are aware that there are side effects, or as in the case of this one, you haven't been able to do the research to attest to the long-term side effects of it.
So you're worried about a repeat of the swine flu, something like narcolepsy pops up or whatever it could be, and then you have to stop it, withdraw it, but those 900 people need to be compensated. And it was 120,000 a person. So you're talking about a lot of money. It's not a small amount.
This is a global thing. You're talking about populations trying to get the entire population to take it. So there's a lot more uptake for this product. Yeah. So of course, you're talking about a much larger payout.
Yes,
in regard to this. And so for me, that is why they need the exemption, because they are not aware of the long-term side
effects. Yeah.
And
so I think that's a good point.
That is the troubling thing here. That what you're saying is, we're going to make you exempt because you don't know the long-term side effects, but we're still going to tell people in the healthcare profession, you need to take this.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it's safe to take.
Yeah.
That's the line by every government official. That's the line by every scientific official. That's the line by everyone. It's safe to take. It's been tested. It's had trials. Don't worry, we've tested it. And, we know that there are 3 stages to any clinical trial. And it feels like they're doing one of those 3 stages on the general population. That's what they're effectively doing. That they're doing one of the 3 stages of clinical trials, because there's 3 stages generally, but one of the 3 stages of clinical trials, we're just going to try it out on the general population, and we're going to just collect that data and see what happens in the long-term side effects, which I think is very frightening for people who have lived through other problematic things like swine flu or like being black in the in a European Western country, etc., etc., etc. So I think that it's a challenge.
Yeah, just one other thing on this subject is that I don't know if they've done it or not. I don't know if they've carried out the trials or not, or the tests for this or not. But some vaccines are contraindicated, so you can't take them together.
Right. Okay.
So when you're doing the vaccinations for people, do you know if this is contraindicated for any of the other vaccinations?
Right.
Because
okay.
That will affect who you can and cannot give these things to.
So for those people who are lay people and who may not know this, so basically, if I understand you correctly, if I take the COVID-19 vaccine, it may affect the efficacy of or the usability of my MenB vaccine or whatever. It can affect one of the other vaccines I have in my system.
If you take them too close together, yes. or it
Right.
could
Okay.
have adverse side effects, as
Yeah.
in it could be very dangerous for you.
To have
It's
these, so they're
like,
contraindicated. Okay.
yeah, so
Right.
it's like taking alcohol with, some other drug. They tell you don't do it. And so my question on this, and as I said, I have no clue, no idea whether it
What the answer is? Yeah.
has or hasn't been done. But then I haven't seen any information that it has been done. And in the absence of that, I assume that it hasn't been done because of the time frame that we're talking about. This is going to be a select demographic that we're talking about here within a certain age range that we're talking about, and whether it's safe to give it to them. So you'd be looking at young children, 3 years old in that demographic. You'd be looking at, in the UK, what age is it you get your BCG?
Teenagers. So the preteens, 11,
Yeah.
it's 11, around that age, preteens.
Is it going to be safe for that age group to take? These are the sort of questions. Then what happens to when you need to take vaccinations for travel? Although nobody's really traveling much these days. But
no, but it is that's a legitimate question, because the idea of the vaccine is to allow you to travel. So,
yeah.
You can't have the two together. There's a problem with that.
So there's a lot of questions that I have. And for me, as I said, it's not necessary that the answers don't exist. It's that they have not been communicated. And I've had this problem with the whole handling of the pandemic, and that information has not been communicated effectively or clearly from the start, which creates a lot of the doubt that we have, and a lot of the mistrust that people have in the vaccination, because there's been no clear, cohesive, effective messaging coming out from the beginning.
No,
in Germany, where there has been pretty much a clear message, 60% of their population are happy to take it.
Yeah. And that it shows it makes a difference. I think if we looked at the statistics in New Zealand, you would probably see something very similar. In countries where consistent, clear, accountable, transparent messaging has happened, they will feel differently about how they take vaccinations. They will feel differently about how they trust their governments, because their governments are also not giving them the same messages that we're receiving here, of course. That's also not being done. And I think in the English speaking world, there are clearly some challenges within some of those governments that are more prominent within the English speaking world. There are real huge issues there. And so this is going to be an ongoing question. So I think if we're going to conclude and wrap up, because we're a bit over our time today, but it was an important subject to actually really do the dark side on. For me, this what it highlights is the need for sensitive, intelligent, respectful discussion, investigation, clear questioning, clear answers being given, and not having knee-jerk reactions. One of the sadness I have seen is that when people have raised legitimate questions in public spaces, they have been treated like pariahs, like outcasts, like anti-vaxxers, like conspiracy theorists. They've been treated badly, where they're clearly, from our conversation, evidenced by so many of the articles that we've talked about from reputable sources, from reputable medical journals, that there are questions that need to be asked, rightly so. There are answers that should be given, rightly so, and that we, the public, deserve to challenge and ask those questions so that we have safe as can be vaccination programs for us and our children. This isn't just about the elderly who are receiving it first, or those people in healthcare. This might be something that sticks around for a long time and becomes part of national programming. And quite frankly, if you want to give it to me, that's one thing. If you want to give it to my kid, that's quite another. Like I have a higher threshold you have to pass for my child than I. So, I think legitimate questions, and not just this blanket kind of approach of being banned from social media, being trolled on, different things, being told you're something you're not, you're just a silly anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorist, blah blah blah. But actually people listening and intelligently engaging with questions is really important on a subject such as this, which has far-reaching consequences. That's my take on it. Yours?
I think that society has fundamentally shifted.
Mm-hmm.
And that this has been going on for decades now, that we are now at the point where historically governments were trusted.
Mm-hmm.
But we are now at the point where trust is like respect. It must be earned. It is not
Mm-hmm.
freely given.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think governments are struggling to adapt to this societal shift. Whereas before they would have said, take this vaccine, it's good for you. People would just go, okay, government said it. I trust the government. They're here to look after me. So we'll take it. Society doesn't exist in that way anymore. And governments don't seem to have reacted to this position or adapted to this position. So all I can say is, if you want my trust, prove you're trustworthy. And when you running off to Bernard Castle, I don't find you trustworthy.
Well, there's that. And on that note, we wish you a brilliant start to the rest of your week. God bless. And thank you for joining us on this edition of The Dark Side. We have one more Dark Side before the vacation. We have 2 weeks off. So over Christmas and New Year's, we'll have a vacation. And everyone will go and play with their children and not think about the dark side for a couple of weeks. I'm sure you will send us your topics, but we have 1 more week to go. So next week's Dark Side is our final one of 2020, the pandemic year, the year that racism became officially a pandemic as opposed to just, are you sure? That activism became bigger and bolder and more global than it has ever been before, and spanned the entire globe, which is wonderful. So we're doing 1 more Dark Side for the year of 2020, which is crazy. So I don't know what our topic is going to be. Send us your suggestions, and we look forward to seeing you next week for the Dark Side. Peace.
Laters.